This talk is about data analysis, data literacy, and modeling for a better world in the year 2025. And our speaker is Frank Wattenberg from the United States Military Academy.
So welcome everybody. First of all, I hope this could be a fairly interactive talk. I don't know about you, but I like just sitting and listening for half an hour. So we've got a relatively small group, and you should feel free to just unmute and say, "Hey, I have a question." I can't keep track of the chat and everything all at once, so I won't try and monitor the chat. Oh, Liam, if you see something in the chat and you think we should respond, just let me know. So feel free to unmute yourself and chime in at any time. So the slide we're looking at now is kind of an overture. And what I'm hoping you're seeing there is some of the themes that will come up during the talk. The thing I'm particularly interested in is how data analysis and data literacy, and for me, it's data analysis, data literacy for a better world, how they've changed in the age of big data and artificial intelligence. So things are happening very quickly. But one of the things I want to emphasize is that some of the trends we're seeing because of big data and artificial intelligence have actually been building for some time. So I'll give you one quick example. One of the big issues in data analysis is independence. And right now, because of the echo chamber, because you see so many things repeated over and over and over again, you get the impression that lots and lots and lots of individual data points, when in fact, it's really the same data point just being repeated. That's been going on for a long time. So we saw that with kind of lower levels of social media. We see that with cable television, where they repeat the same things over and over again. So one of the big issues, as I mentioned, is independence, but that's been a building issue. I want to call your attention to the two blue bullets in the bottom right on the screen. So in the middle, you'll see a bullet that says fast thinking and slow thinking. And that's one of the things that I think is really important. We're going to talk about how people build understanding and how they communicate understanding. And Dan Kahneman did some really nice work, and he distinguishes between two kinds of thinking, what he calls fast thinking, which happens very quickly. It's unconscious, lots of things going on at once. And the best way to get a picture of what fast thinking is to just close your eyes for a second, open your eyes, and instantaneously you build this three-dimensional picture of what the world looks like right around you. That's fast thinking in action. Lots of things going on all at once. The other kind of thinking that he talks about is slow thinking. That's slow, more rational, logical, more conscious. These days, in the artificial intelligence community, we talk about learning and design. So learning is very much like fast thinking. Design is very much like slow thinking, and we'll come back to those terminologies later. So we're living in a world that's changing very rapidly. And as I was putting this together, I saw a quote from Bret Stephens. He's not one of my favorite authors, but in this case, he said something that really hit home to me. So he said, "Please, Democrats, stop trying to see the world through data and analytics. If there's one lesson in last year's race, it's that Democrats need to relearn to trust what their eyes, ears, and guts tell them." So I would paraphrase that or change it. Please, scientists, stop trying to see and communicate, especially communicate the world primarily through data and analytics. If there's one lesson in last year's race, it's that scientists need to relearn to communicate. People trust what their eyes, ears, and guts tell them. And that's one of the big problems right now, that people are getting all this information every day. And if that doesn't comport, if it doesn't agree with what we're telling them, they're just not going to hear it. So this is the framework that I'm going to use, and you're going to see this slide come back several times. Our goal here is understanding. So what we want to do is we want to build our own intuitive understanding within ourselves, but we also want to communicate that understanding. And we gain that understanding from three different kinds of thinking. There's this fast thinking that I talked about earlier. is slow thinking, which I also talked about earlier. There's a third kind, which we'll talk about more, which I'm going to call intuition or imagination. They're all closely related with each other. And big data is a very tiny part of fast thinking. Data analysis is a very tiny part of slow thinking. And what I want to do is understand the role of data in this larger picture of how we build and communicate understanding. So I'm going to use it as an example, and I think it's really important that when we talk, we take rich examples. The example I'm going to use is a question: to what extent and how does illegal immigration impact crime? I picked that example both because of its richness. There's a lot of data out there, and because it's really important. It has very, very important consequences for public policy. And as you know, it's a very controversial subject. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to begin with 4 action items that I think are really important. And in the upper left-hand corner, you see Wayne State University, which is where I did my undergraduate work. In the upper right corner, you see the University of Wisconsin at Madison, which is where I did my graduate work. And in the middle is the most important. That's your campus. So what I hope we'll talk about here is some of the kinds of things we can do on our own campuses. So the first action item, if you're lucky enough to teach at a college or a university with a diverse staff, diverse students, and diverse faculty, what you want to do is you want to invite people with different backgrounds to provide nuance and humanity to the data about the impact of crime and immigration. So numbers are important. We're all scientists, we're all mathematicians. We think in terms of numbers, but we also think what's behind those numbers. So for example, we're going to get numbers about prevalence of crime, but you want to ask people who live in neighborhoods, in households with mixed immigrant status to talk about how the threat of deportation, for example, of illegal immigrants affects family members who are citizens or hold green cards. They're here perfectly legitimately, perfectly legally. We also want to ask people about the indirect impact of crime. So many people, I live about 50 miles from New York City, and we get the New York City news, and it's filled with all this information about crime. And people avoid certain areas and certain neighborhoods because of their perception of rampant crime. So it's important not just to understand the incidence of crime, but the impact it has on the people around them. So I'm going to pause for a moment, and I'm going to just ask for you to comment a little bit and just unmute yourself and say something. On your campus, how easy would it be for you to invite people to come into your classrooms to talk to your students about some of the issues that might be important? Okay, we'll move forward then. And I hope you'll feel free to interrupt at any time. Okay, the second action item has to do with provenance and integrity. So when you look at any kind of information, any kind of data, there are 2 things that are really important. First of all, where did it come from? How trustworthy is it? And secondly, the integrity of the data you're being given. So as scientists, we often complain that our work is distorted. It's distorted by cherry picking, distorted by omitting context, and it's especially true for work based on data. So this is one of the places that we can take immediate action. What we can do is we can demand, both individually and through our professional societies, that anytime our work is published and that it in its entirety and the data on which it is based is publicly available and not behind paywalls. So we want a situation where anytime you see data, anytime somebody's reading data or reading any kind of a scientific report, they can see the whole thing and make some judgments on their own how good that data is. Okay, here's another immediate action item. The United States and New Zealand are 2 countries that allow what's called direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical ads. And if you watch TV at all, you'll see lots and lots of ads all the time, and they're well produced, they're filled with beautiful music, and there's dancing and singing, and that creates a kind of impression that I think is very bad. I think part of the reason that people distrust scientists and other experts, and it's linked to their distrust of elites, is because in many ways we've earned that distrust. So, for example, when health professionals are talking wares for profit on TV with lots of music, that undermines people's confidence in the fact that we're dispassionate scientists, that we're honest scientists. And there's a disconnect between everyday exposure to profit-driven ads and less flashy information from sources like CDC. So one way we can combat that is we can talk about teaching. We can teach and talk about direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical ads in the United States and New Zealand. Now, I mentioned that things are moving very quickly, and you'll notice I put down the CDC. That's one of the places I go for information that I can trust. And of course, I saw this on the internet just a couple days ago. So this is from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and I'm showing this big picture here so that you can get a picture of where it came from. It's from a page that's a guidance document, diversity action plans to improve enrollment of participants from underrepresented populations to clinical studies. I'm going to enlarge that blue rectangle so you can read it. So I'm going to let you read that. For a court order, HHS is required to restore this website as of 11:59 p.m. on February 11th, 2025. Any information on this page promoting gender ideology is extremely inaccurate and disconnected from the immutable biological reality that there are two sexes, male and female. The Trump administration rejects gender ideology and condemns the harm it causes to children by promoting their chemical and surgical mutilation and to women by depriving them of dignity, safety, well-being, and opportunities. This page does not reflect biological reality, and therefore the administration, this department, rejected. I don't know what you think about that, but I know that that tells me that the CDC is no longer a place that I can go for dispassionate, objective, scientific information. So one of the things we need to do, I know I'm going to do, is I'm going to bookmark equivalent agencies in other countries and hope I can continue to get some reliable information. Okay, so here is a third action item, and it's based on the picture I showed you before. There are three kinds of thinking: what's called fast thinking, what's called slow thinking, and what I'm going to call intuition, imagery, or modeling. And this is something I came upon. It's an idea really of George Bessis, and I'll talk more about him later on. But the idea is this, that we build in our minds a kind of intuitive model. We use the term imagery or imagination. It's kind of a big, what I would say, strategic level model of what the world is like. And it's that kind of model, often it's a visual model, that we want to be able to communicate. So as scientists, especially for mathematicians, we tend to rely on the slow, formal, rigorous mathematics. But real understanding is built on this intuition imagery model. And we need to help our students and our readers build their own. So data by itself has very limited ability to build and communicate understanding. It's really this kind of intuitive model. This idea is so important that I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what I mean. So this is the first example. We're all in this room familiar with it. It's the SIR model, and it has several qualities that are really, really key. First of all, it's really simple. It's very intuitive. Any of us who've lived around for a long time have been well, caught a cold or something, we've recovered, we've watched cold spread. It's simple, it's intuitive. It's easy to be refined, made more useful. So on the right, you see a slightly more complicated model where we've introduced isolation. I was originally going to talk more about this, but if anybody hasn't seen Liz Arnold's talk from yesterday, it's great. I mean, she had a wonderful discussion of the SIR model and how she and her colleagues teach it. So rather than spend more time on that, I'm going to just suggest that you take a look at that. It's an absolutely wonderful talk. Here's another example, slightly more complicated model. This is the model of the greenhouse effect. And on the left, you see the basic idea. You know, we get incoming solar radiation, we have outgoing energy in several different ways. Again, the basic idea is very simple. It can be refined. The picture I put up on the left is fairly complicated, but it can get much more complicated, much more useful. What I really like about this model is it's everyday testable. So one of the experiments I often do with my students is we park our car out in the sunlight and we put two thermometers in the car, one that's in the passenger compartment and one that's in the trunk. And what you see is that over the course of the day, the temperature in the passenger compartment rises much higher than it does in the trunk. And it's essentially due to this greenhouse effect. What happens is light comes in through the windows, it heats up the fabric, the interior of the car. That car tries to re-radiate the energy, but it's blocked by the windows and so on. So this is a really nice example of a model that people can test by themselves. They don't have to rely on reading books or authority figures. So now I'm going to go back and look at data. And I want to talk about three essential features of data. The first is this idea of provenance and integrity. The second is this idea of primary data, secondary data, or tertiary data. And the third is the idea of independence. And those are three essential features of data. They've always required care and attention, but modern social media and AI have made these problems much, much worse. So I'm going to use the paper Unauthorized Immigration, Crime, and Recidivism, Evidence from Texas, and a data set as an example. And I'll give you the reference for that later on. So the data set we're going to use, that he uses, this Michael T. Light uses, comes from the Texas Department of Public Safety, called Computerized Criminal History System. And what they did in Texas was the Department of Homeland Security and Texas cooperated completely, and they checked and recorded the immigration status of all the arrestees throughout the state, including their legal status. This data set includes a lot of information and fairly detailed and descriptive information on arrest, conviction, recidivism, and case processing of unauthorized immigrants. So this is data that looks really, really good. This is probably one of the best data sets you're going to run into. We know its provenance. We know its integrity. In terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary, you'd probably use the term primary data for this. That's the best kind of data. It hasn't been messed with. I'm going to look at something a little bit different than the difference in raw and interpreted data. So one of the differences between primary, secondary, and tertiary data is primary data, that's the original data. You're looking at the raw stuff. Nobody has gotten involved with it. Nobody has done any adjustments, maybe done any selection. As you go from secondary to tertiary, you get further away from the original. And there's been all sorts of opportunity for errors to creep in. I want to talk about that as a continuum from raw to interpreted data. So we think of this data sounds like it's absolute primary. It really does. But when I was young, well, still, my dad was an expert on juvenile delinquency. And he used to ride around in police cars with policemen and kind of record what happened. And it was really interesting when a policeman comes across a situation, that policeman has to make a lot of decisions. Was a crime committed? Should he or she make an arrest? And those decisions are all different. They're very subjective. They depend on the situation. And so even before that arrest record is entered, the record of what happened, decisions are being made. So even this data, which looks absolutely primary, looks really raw, has been subject to interpretation. And finally, independence. There's some common, you might say, oh, I have 1,000 cases here, but maybe 50 of them involve the same officer. So you need to really look at those kinds of issues. Okay, so I wanted to have at least one slide that had a differential equation on. And what you're looking at the bottom is very traditional analysis of people's opinions on things. And this is the kind of analysis, I'm not going to have time, see I'm running short of time already. These are probability density functions that show the distribution of opinions about something. And you can get these very nicely from this equation. That equation, of course, is beyond a first-year class, but you can certainly talk about what it means. This may be completely out of date now in our current situation. It may be that events are overwhelming that. So, but point, there used to be a sharp distinction between qualitative data, sometimes categorical data, and quantitative data. That's now completely gone. Modern artificial intelligence can convert things like video and audio to a form that can be analyzed using computers. Artificial intelligence uses very high dimensional vectors to represent lots of information about things like words. ChatGPT 4.0 uses 12,000 dimensional computer generated vectors to represent the meaning of a word. So a word like male or female or Hispanic, those words have much more nuanced meaning now, and it's important. And because we can use modern AI, we can analyze in a much more meaningful way. Okay, just coming back to this, and I'm almost out of time, I guess. Our goal here is to build understanding, and we talked about these three different ways of building understanding. Underlying all that is this idea of truth. So we need to talk to our students about what do you trust? And the first thing I want to point out is it's very important to use the idea of working truth. We never know the whole truth with 100% certainty. The best we can do, have a work of knowledge. This is what we know at this time. This is what we think is true at this time. And that working truth is built up by this triangle understanding here. And I kind of like this picture in the middle here, where you have this picture of a flower, and you see it in its full color only because of what the fast thinking, the slow thinking, and the intuition all put together and build for you. So how do we find the working truth? And the answer is I don't have the answer, but I'm convinced that this picture is the important one. That as you try and build up this picture of working truth, you use a combination of fast thinking, slow thinking, intuitive thinking. You build your model, your theory, understanding, you analyze that, you build your working truth, and then you challenge it, you test it against the real world. That's why I like things like that experiment with the thermometers in the car. You really can test your idea of what's going on against reality. And finally, here's the references I promised you. So Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, it's a great book. I highly recommend reading it. David Bassis, I like books that really make me think, books that I agree with and books that I disagree with. David Bassis' books is wonderful. I agree with an awful lot of what he says. I disagree with a lot of what he says. Very provocative, very challenging, worth reading. The English translation, it's a secret world of intuition and curiosity. If you read French, I highly recommend the French version instead. For one thing, it's cheaper. Here's a reference for the paper by Michael White that I mentioned. And finally, that last reference, if you go down there, it will give you some notes that are background notes to this talk. And my address, frank.wattenberg@mac.com. So I think I'm right on time. Thank you very much.